mathematics was a science of exactitudes. It lifted things out of doubt and generality and resulted in a formation or a formularization of knowledge, which has continued to support our various activities from a very remote time. Now, astronomy was not possible until mathematics came along. And mathematics took the universal system that we see around us and began the gradual organization of it. That is, it did nothing to change the system, but to organize our concept of the system. It began to reveal to us the really wonderful universe in which we lived. It's gradually revealed to us that things were not accidental, that there were laws and rules governing practically every procedure and function of the universe. The combination, therefore, of mathematics and astronomy, added together, formed what has been called astrotheology. That is, religion based upon the supporting evidence of nature. In other words, it was possible to decide certain values, moral and otherwise, because of their symbolic place in the natural world around us. We began to realize, for instance, the very simple fact that there aren't many accidents in the functions of universal law. We began to realize the effects that follow causes, and also the timing of cycles. We began to develop the theory of protecting agriculture through knowing the seasons and all the different forms of planting and reaping came to our attention and were integrated into a pattern. It all added up to one simple fact. We were living in a wonderful universe ruled by something. Now, what it was ruled by was still a little dim, because the physical form of the universe seemed to be all that we could find out about it. But gradually there came to the realization of these people that the physical universe was a symbol, that the processes which exist and make the universe a symbol are invisible. And gradually, out of the contemplation of visible things, we began to recognize the need for invisible forces behind these things. We could see bodies, but we couldn't see the life in them. But we could find out something about it by watching its effects in the material world. We could not control completely our integration of the vastness of the universe, but we were able to gradually create a series of laws by which we could obey the simple phenomena of life. And out of this research, this thoughtfulness of primitive people, we have the moral code. The moral code is based firmly upon universal laws, laws that men never quite understood fully, but the results of which came to their attention every day, until finally they were forced to accept the causes because there was no other way of explaining the effects. So little by little, knowledge increased. And then there came quite an interesting division in this problem. Namely, knowledge considered on the one hand as beneficial, and knowledge on the other hand as dangerous. It became obvious that knowledge brought with it power. And it is also a fact that was known to very ancient people, that power is temptation, and power can lead to most of the disasters which can occur to the human being. Therefore, knowledge without ethics, skills without integration of consciousness, the individual operating in the material universe without sensing the responsibilities which are involved in existence, was a danger and a menace to the rest of society. There was no way of once withdrawing knowledge that had been given. Once the knowledge was available, nothing could put it back again into secrecy. The only answer to this problem was to keep it secret from the beginning. Now, the problem of secrecy was largely in the hands of a philosophical priesthood, or perhaps we might say a great theological structure. This structure was dedicated to non-profit. These teachers and philosophers were dedicated to the service of humanity and were free from all the temptations of personal aggrandizement. These, in turn, decided to censor knowledge so that it might be safely communicated. Knowledge that could not be communicated would die with the original owner. Therefore, there had to be a way of handing down knowledge from one generation to another. And as time went on, it had to spread from one nation to another until it finally reached the circumference of the entire planet. So to do this successfully, something had to be done to protect those forms of knowledge which by exploitation could become a menace to the survival of peoples. This story is more or less also unfolded in the Platonic account of the destruction of Atlantis. In Atlantis, skill became greater than morality. Power took over. Ethics was compromised. And finally, the entire continent destroyed itself. The misuse of knowledge must end in tragedy, must end in disaster. And if this disaster is not curbed in some way, it could topple over a civilization. So the ancients decided the one way was to put certain restrictions upon the dissemination of knowledge. These restrictions, added up together, formed a kind of system of instruction, which came to be known as the mysteries. These mysteries were schools, universities, colleges, dedicated to the preservation and dissemination of knowledge under direction and control. The individual who desired knowledge and recognized the need of it was placed under certain restrictions, must take obligations, must prove through long training and discipline worthiness to receive knowledge. It was the purpose of these ancient teachers to make sure that nothing important to the advancement of man could be captured and held by selfishness or ambition or avarice. It was necessary, therefore, to select the custodians of knowledge. For this reason, we find most of the ancient teachers had schools or systems by which they communicated knowledge. The school of Pythagoras at Crotona was one of the most famous of the ancient world. The school of Plato at Athens was another. And in the far distances of Asia, we find the old gurus with their disciples studying the mysteries of life under leadership and under discipline. As time went on, of course, much of this knowledge gradually crept into public domain. The old institutions faded away under the pressure of changing beliefs and policies. Ambitious individuals without knowledge or skill were able to gradually attract and gather around themselves armies and systems of followers, and these began to attack and destroy the great institutions of learning. In other words, the great protection was the wisdom of the few, and in order that the many could control, this wisdom had to be curtailed or stamped out in some way. The mystery system fell under considerable pressure, but it never entirely ceased. And even today there are evidences of the perpetuation of this system of rulership and protection. So now we go back again to the problem that we started with, and that is mathematics and astronomy. Astronomy has passed through a great many different levels of insights and interpretations. Astronomy was originally the science of the anatomy and physiology and function of the solar system. It had to do with every process in which the natural laws of existence went into obvious operation within the consciousness of that part of life which man could comprehend. So the problem was to gradually discover some way of transforming a skeletal system to become the basis of a great theological mystery. The result was astrotheology, which was probably the first organization of man's religious beliefs. This organization was firmly established in mathematics and astronomy. And the graces which assisted under the heading of music and art have always been part of classical religions. All of these religious systems, therefore, became gradually integrated around astronomy, mathematics, and music. Those who wish to enter the school of Pythagoras must first pass an examination in these three sciences, for to the ancients music was also a science. Any of the other teachers who came along or were in other parts of the world put similar restraints upon the communication of knowledge. They had to test the individual as to whether he was truly worthy, on the grounds that the more he knew, the more he could pervert knowledge. If he was selfish, he could use it to destroy or offend or disintegrate the society to which he belonged. It also would provide him with the ambitions which might lead him to conquest, war, and many great disasters. So the ancients had these testings. Now Homer, in a section of his writings called The Cave of the Nymphs, describes the initiation rituals of the ancient astrotheology. And we first point out and notice that the one great religious, astronomical, mathematical day was New Year's, the winter solstice. This was the beginning of the year for antiquity. At the beginning of the year, this solstice point was of the greatest and most basic importance. Well, I think we must also realize in studying this that practically every religion and esoteric system we have in the world today developed in the northern hemisphere. And all of the calculations that are made are based upon the precession of the equinoxes and, of course, the solar system of the year in the area of the northern hemisphere. At that time, we find the zodiac already fairly well known. We find that most of the symbols found in religion were also to be found in astronomy. We realize, for example, that the 72 elders of Israel were the 5-degree divisions of the circle of the zodiac. We know that the 12 signs became 12 apostles, 12 disciples, 12 leaders, and also that the course of time were associated with 12 major religious revelations. We find that almost every unit that has to do with man's survival is in some way mathematically keyed to the zodiac. Now, in the old time, and even later in the mystical writings of Jacob Boehme, the arrangement of the zodiac is slightly different from what we generally use in astronomy or astrology today. We still begin, technically, the zodiac with the sign of Aries. But whereas we usually think of this as placed on the eastern angle of a horoscope, in the ancient times the sign of Aries was placed in the midheaven. In other words, it was at the highest point, and that was the point of we might say, the beginning of the year, the New Year's ceremony, usually occurring between the 20th and the 25th or 27th of December. At this time, the sun was born again. It rose from the dead of the old year. It began to move northward, and in moving northward with its own strange power, began to release the life locked in the earth. So the ancients considered the sun as the principal symbol of deity. No ancient person of wisdom or insight ever thought of the sun as that being, but rather the mirror of it. To the Greeks, the sun god carried a shield, and this shield was the mirror of the sun. It was not the sun, but the sun was there as a symbol of order, life, resurrection, fertility, and inwardly of the illumination of the soul. Therefore, the sun became an object of worship everywhere. In Egypt, for instance, in the course of the development of the doctrine of Akhenaten, the great reformer of Egyptian mysticism, the Aton, or sun, was the supreme symbol. This symbol, in the Egyptian, was a ball of light surrounded by radiant rays, each of the rays ending in the symbol of the human hand. Therefore, the sun was radiating in all directions, lifting up everything that came in contact with, bringing death to life out of the earth. Now, this seemed to be very interesting to most ancient people. It helped them to understand something about life, which otherwise was too difficult for them. The sun also, whether we realize it or not, became a symbol of deity in early Christianity. It was definitely associated with the nimbus, the halo, and the radiance around the heads of saints. It was the symbol of spiritual light manifesting through the physical light of nature. The sun as a spiritual power brought enlightenment to the inner life, releasing the individual from ignorance, superstition, and fear. In the outer world, the sun was the generator of life and the regenerator of everything that man depended on for survival. Without the light of the sun, he could not live. Also, therefore, that part of the world where the sun was above the horizon was the good part, the life part. Night was the dark part. Night was darkness, mystery, and death. Day was light, brightness, and wisdom. So that the life of the individual was gradually divided into these two hemispheres, the hemisphere of light and the hemisphere of darkness. Light became the symbol of growth and hope and wisdom. Darkness was a groping. Therefore, darkness became an appropriate symbol of ignorance. That which was ignorant lived in darkness. That which was wise lived in light. Now, how did the ancients understand ignorance? To the common people, ignorance was lack of formal education. To the priests of the mystery, ignorance was the lack of internal realization of good. Therefore, all of the changes that take place in the world, in the seasons and in the ages, in the great processional of the equinoxes, all these things have their equivalent within the person himself. He had his solstices and his equinoxes. He had all of the different planets of the system. He had all the different zones and spheres and degrees of the zodiac within his own constitution. And out of this came the great symbol of the grand man of the universe. This was very strongly emphasized in the Kabbalah and also in the early rites of the Rosicrucians and other mystical associations in Europe. So to find that the universe was the great man and that man was the little universe gave rise to the concept of the macrocosm and the microcosm, the large world and the small world. And these two were bound together by sympathies which could not be broken. These combinations went on forever, and every creature in its own way of life, in its own little cycles, long or short, had to go through the cycle of the great year in the universe around them. Now, as Homer points out in the Cave of the Nymphs, with Aries at the top point in this cycle, then the vernal equinox at that time was said to occur in Cancer, which was the next important point. Then the summer solstice took place in Libra, and the autumnal equinox in Capricorn. Now this made the universe into a kind of temple, and it resulted in what are now known as circumambulations. In nearly all religions, including Christianity, there are certain rites of walking around an altar, or in the area around a building, or on a kind of balcony around a sacred center. And the place of circumambulation is still retained in practically all European cathedrals. But this circumambulation was really the story of the sun walking around the zodiac. going from one degree to another and bringing in each case certain basic and fundamental changes. Now, in this particular phase of the matter, we find the solar mystery very much adapted to other forms of thought. In every case, practically, the supreme deity was a light deity, a deity of life, light, beauty, and truth. The opposite of this were the so-called evil spirits that lived in darkness. In India, the light spirits are called suras, and the dark spirits are called asuras. And light and darkness were always locked in a conflict as to which should dominate, whether light or darkness would control or rule the conduct of the individual. And of course, this conflict went right into the individual himself, the light and dark parts of his own nature. The light parts were his hopes and aspirations. The dark parts were his selfishness, his aggressions, and all the negative attitudes which he permitted to flourish within himself. It was assumed that every evil thing was dark. The reason being that in darkness, the evil has to represent ignorance. Nothing that is wise is dark. This has nothing to do with the appearance or physical structure of the individual, but has to do with the inner construction of his life. Wherever light rules that person, he is light. Where darkness is allowed to go uncorrected and no effort is made to improve oneself, then the darkness is there. And darkness is selfishness, it is self-centeredness, it is corruption, and it is all of the evils which have afflicted man since the beginning of his existence. So the light and dark situation now portends. And we know that every year at the winter solstice, the sun god is born. In the temples that were built in Greece, Egypt, India, China, and many other places, the symbolism of the solar system was built into the architecture, so that it was there in every case. The Temple of Solomon, the mysterious temples of India and China were all, like the Cathedral of Christianity, solar symbols. And in these solar symbols, as in the Greek mysteries, the human being himself now plays the role of the sun. In other words, the year of the sun becomes the symbol of the life of the individual. The individual, so to say, psychologically at least, is born at the winter solstice. He comes into his growth or embodiment at the vernal equinox. He attains the maximum at the parting of the ways at Libra, and he goes on into age until he reaches Capricorn. And these are 9 spokes of a wheel. And the so-called broken wheel in religious symbolism is the wheel with 9 spokes and 3 broken ones. In man, the generational structure is that the prenatal epoch consists of 9 solar months. Therefore, man is born of the broken wheel. Furthermore, of course, the ancients said that man, coming to true birth, must pass through 9 months in the womb of his mother and 3 months in the womb of the temple. In other words, the year was completed by 3 initiatory degrees by which the individual came into his own maturity. The individual was born with 3/4 of the circle. The other quarter of the circle had to be earned. And the 3 degrees of this earning have been perpetuated in most of the religious and mystical organizations of the world from the beginning. So the individual, to perfect his life, must pass through the experiences which are indicated by this solar system structure. Homer tells us, for instance, that souls coming into birth entered through the sign of Cancer, and at that time they drank of the cup of Mnemosyne, of forgetfulness, and forgot all else but what's coming in the future. They then descended through Leo, Virgo, to Libra. And Libra was a pair of scales. And the Libra scales is the psychostasia of Egypt, the weighing of the soul. It is the dividing point between the involutionary and evolutionary march of the soul through the zodiac. Having attained this balance, and having been tested, the soul then begins to emerge from the chrysalis of its material existence. And from the time it enters Libra to the time it reaches Capricorn, it is advancing toward enlightenment. At Capricorn, it comes to the gate of exit from the body. The Cancer is the entrance to the cave. Capricorn is the exit. And therefore the cave is embodiment, incarnation, and establishment in the material universe. In Capricorn, the individual comes to the end of material existence. Therefore, we almost always represent the sign of Capricorn as an old man with a scythe walking with a tiny child that has just been born. This symbolism is derived directly from the ancient mysteries and the rites that were a part of it in very remote times. Therefore, that Capricorn, the individual, theoretically departs from this life, or under the mysteries of initiation, departs from materiality. The signs from Cancer around to Capricorn represent materiality. Here the individual has to pass through all of the labors of the Hercules, who performs 12 labors, or Sindad the sailor, who makes 12 journeys, or wherever the 12 comes into the pattern. We are dealing with the zodiac. Then when it comes to Capricorn, the individual regains his lost memory and emerges from the cave into the clear atmosphere above. Now, when you look at the zodiac in this way and you place Aries at the top, then you realize that Aquarius and Pisces are between Capricorn and the reunion with deity. These represent, and found in the old symbolism, the experiences of the consciousness in the development of its extrasensory perceptions. Aquarius becomes the symbol of the great innovation of true knowledge, the great dedication. And in astrology, it is the house of the friendship. In the mysteries, it was the symbol of universal citizenship, in which the individual now becomes a part of the universal mystery. And Pisces is the symbol of illumination, or the esoteric fulfillment of the journey. And thus it goes completely around the wheel. The first two signs, after Aries, Taurus and Gemini, are not involved in embodiment, but they are involved in the superphysical aspect of the universe. Because the 5 signs, Aquarius, Pisces, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, belong to the invisible world of causes, from which the soul descends into embodiment. And from the time it enters embodiment to the time when it casts off the body, it remains obscured. It remains concealed from its own identity. It must struggle in darkness. Now, in the mystery system, this is a point of great importance, because from the time the entity enters through the gate of Cancer, of birth, to the time when it exits again through Capricorn, it is in a world which is strange to it. It is in a world in which it is being tested for its own immortality. Not that the immortality is threatened, but because until the soul has made this journey, it cannot be safely entrusted with the great truths of life. This is the place, or the sphere of learning. And the learning must be gradually based upon one factor only, internal integrities. In the lower hemisphere of darkness, or of ignorance, there is no great light available. Almost all of us recognize now the failure of materialism. Well, the lower half of the great circle is the sphere of materialism. Materialism is the ethical darkness. It is the darkness which has resulted from man turning from the ways of light, or refusing to light the darkness by his own conduct. The labor of the individual, therefore, is to bring light into darkness. First, the light coming in himself from his own darkness, and then later bestowing light upon the whole world which is in darkness. Therefore, the great teachers are the light bearers, who must bring light and hope to the dark semicircle of the lower half of the zodiac. Now, in getting into this, then, we find what we know today to be true, that we live in the material world, which is a world of uncertainties. Our facts are very few. Our convictions are numerous and conflicting. We do not any of us have the answers to the ultimate. And we are not going to have those answers given to us. We must release them from within ourselves. Therefore, in this hemisphere of darkness, each individual must work out his own salvation with diligence. Those were the last words of the Buddha. We must each of us find the light according to our own integrities. To do this, we must have dedication. And this dedication is, whether we realize it or not, bestowed by birth itself. From that time on, we must develop this dedication by personal effort. We must resist every day those forces and conditions which perpetuate darkness. And darkness is always lack of the final form of light, ethics, or the recognition of the essential values of integrities. If the individual goes along this pathway, he comes, as in the Egyptian ritual, finally into the great hall of the twin truths in Amentet, the abode of the great god Osiris. Now, Osiris has as a symbol an eye, and that eye, of course, is the sun. And this eye represents the sun of the underworld. When the individual is in the lower half of the zodiac, the only sun that can shine into his life is from within himself. He must gradually release the great light that was bestowed upon him in heaven or in the divine worlds. In the meantime, if he comes into the hall of Amentet, he stands before Osiris, who wears the plumes of the north and south, that is, the plumes of the spiritual and material halves of the zodiac. The crown of Osiris is inclined exactly to the degree of the solar axis at the present time. In other words, the ancients knew the inclination of the axis. This deity, then, becomes the judge of the quick and the dead. And this deity is the sun in its karmic aspect. The soul of the deceased person is represented by a symbol. And this soul goes into the presence of Osiris to be judged, to be weighed in the balance. And we have here a very interesting series of symbolical rituals, which can be mentioned briefly. First of all, the court of Osiris in the underworld is the place for the assessors or the judges. And this was the origin of the present jury system, where the individual is judged either victorious or defeated by a jury of his peers. In addition to the juries, which sit at the upper end of the great papyrus symbols on the scrolls of the Book of the Dead, there comes forward the defender, the public defender. In this case, the public defender is the one and only son of Osiris, born posthumously after his father's death, therefore called the son of the widow. And this deity, Horus, with the eyes of the solar hawk, stands before his father and asks leniency for the soul under judgment. And as the trial proceeds, this leniency becomes, in a sense, the fact that Osiris' son is going to carry the guilt of the person if he cannot survive the test by his own strength. Then the weighing of the soul takes place. And on one end of the balance is the feather of the law, Mayat. And on the other end is a little vase containing the heart of the dead person. And the dead person's heart cries out in the ritual, "Let me not perish with the body that dies in a day." Therefore, the soul asks for consideration and forgiveness. The prosecuting attorney is in the form of Typhon, the mysterious water beast of the Egyptians, a creature combining in symbolism the attributes of a hippopotamus and an alligator. This is the one that is to receive the soul if it is not able to go on to the better life. And of course, to the Egyptians, the meaning was very obvious. This creature that swallows up the imperfect soul is re-embodiment. If it doesn't pass, it must come back. In the meantime, the balance is made, and Horus, the son, pleads with his father, interceding for the soul of the person who is passed on. And then because Horus is the only begotten son of his father is lenient to the world through his son, and forgives the soul and permits it to go in peace. It's a very interesting ritual, and has been found in one form or another throughout the whole world. Now, as the scene continues, we know that Libra is the sign of the balance. We know that it is the place where the path breaks between going forward and failing to go forward. In every case, there comes the time when the journey downward into sorrow and fear comes to an end because the soul has achieved a victory over its own weaknesses. It is then weighed in the balance. And if the balance balances, it then goes on into the upper cycles. And this is the reason for the sign of Libra, the scales, being exactly opposite the sign of Aries, which is the symbol of the great winter power. This symbolism then goes on, and we find that the human being is the solar symbol. The human being is the creature that must make the circle of the zodiac inside of itself, not out in the world, but it must perform the 12 labors, and through the performance of the 12 labors, prove that it is ready and worthy to receive enlightenment. So we followed then the time when the sun moves northward. The sun moves northward beginning at the winter solstice. And here it is for the first time starting out on a new journey. Now the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Hindus all knew that the sun wasn't actually born at the winter solstice. It was in a sense reborn annually. It had to come back each year to the beginning of a new cycle of existence and experience. Therefore, an embodiment was a new cycle, but not a true beginning from antiquity. So forth from the beginning, the soul moves gradually northward to produce at the vernal equinox the mystery of spring. And the mystery of spring was also very heavily believed by practically all peoples of antiquity. It was the symbol of the coming of the new fertility. That which was conceived in Aries is born into material life in Cancer. And of course, the sign of Cancer is always the vernal equinox, and this occurs whenever the time is necessary and right. This is when the soul enters into embodiment. Now, the vernal equinox follows. Now this is with Aries in the midheaven, not with Aries on the eastern horizon. The time of Easter is therefore the great symbol of the resurrection of the dying God. The ancient light promise is fulfilled, for it was believed in the ancients that the coming of the vernal equinox was the proof of the pact between God and man, that at this time, if this equinox occurred, it was because the whole world had a new lease on life, a new opportunity to perfect itself, a new chance to be truly wise and good. And if the world didn't end in a terrible conflagration at the vernal equinox, then man's hopes were fulfilled. He was to be given another opportunity to perfect and unfold his own nature.